All right, rocking. So, I just pulled this. I basically like typed into the tier list website Cataclysm tier 11 bosses, and this is what I found. And I was like, damn, that's a lot of rows. But I was thinking like, all right, I'm gonna delete some. And I was like, wait, maybe out of respect for the creator, we like leave them in and cook with 10 different tiers. I don't know, it could be fun. I am with my raid leader, Moon, raid lead and GM of the guild. Welcome on Benediction. And we're gonna be looking at and ranking all the bosses in Cataclysm tier 11. That's Bastion of Twilight, Throne of the Four Winds, and Blackwing Descent, based on difficulty. Also, wait, Moon, I'm gonna cut you off. I realized I had Discord muted up to this point.
Okay, start it over. Yeah, Atramedes is definitely the easiest boss in there. It's like very simple. You don't need too much coordination. So it's really important if your guild is having trouble on Magmaw and Omnitron, just do them on normal, get to the middle bosses, and get some easy loot.
I think this is an interesting point, because I don't know if you progress Atramedes first though. Like I get it's the easiest fight, and it makes sense. Like I agree with all your points about it's a little counterintuitive that you wouldn't start progressing the first boss of an instance, but I kind of also would encourage guilds to try Halfus as a heroic fight, even though I think Halfus is, we'll get to this one. I think Halfus is a slightly more difficult encounter, just because it's like really easy to like get into, and based on how much time you have available to raid for that evening, you can very quickly think or budget to yourself, okay, now we need to move on. Like let's swap to normal and keep going.
What's interesting about Halfus is the rest of that raid, Bastion of Twilight, is actually much harder than most of BWD.
I agree.
So it's really not a bad idea to go and do Halfus heroic, get it down, and then just do the rest of Bastion on normal, and then you can go and spend the rest of your night working on BWD bosses. Yeah. So yeah, I think Halfus and Atramedes are both, pretty easy and both really good first bosses to hit.
Okay, right on. So if we go with 1 being the most difficult fights on the planet, and then 10 being the easiest, where would you slot in Atramedes? And I guess we can touch on Halfus a bit more, but starting with Atramedes.
Yeah, I think I would put Atramedes at a 10, and then Halfus at a 9.
Okay.
I think those are pretty fair. And we can, of course, adjust the stuff as we go on.
Right? Yeah.
Oh, I think there is something to bring up for Atramedes. If you guys have watched Shindig's video on how to do the boss, you'll see that there are actually 2 main ways of doing this boss. A lot of guilds do like the spread out, and everyone's kind of free for all, and everyone just dodge stuff on your own. Our guild actually opts to use a safer strategy, in our opinion, where we all stack up together and we all dodge the sonar together, and it pretty much makes it like a group activity instead of personal responsibility. And for us, it made it like really simple, really easy. So if you want to, I definitely recommend trying out that strategy.
And then for Halfus, I guess I'd be curious where you would add on to this, but so the reason I mentioned that I think Halfus is slightly harder than Atramedes is because there's like the first 30 seconds of Halfus is like actually quite difficult. It's like complete chaos. And
Phase 2 can actually be very deadly too. But it's like if you get to that point, like the boss usually will just die anyway.
Yeah, okay. That's fair.
But yeah, the first 30 seconds are a lot of tank damage. There's a lot of stuff going on. You have to use all your cooldowns and just send it.
Like, Halfus is a great fight where we should set up like assignments ahead of time or set like plans for certain people, because if you don't and you just run in there, it's good. It's not going to go well. There's a lot of like small things that need to get taken care of with which tank is on which ad. Are we taunting the correct times? Are we interrupting the boss? Oops, one of our DPS forgot to trigger one of the dragons at the start of the pool. Like, there's a lot of small things that could go wrong.
Yeah. I mean, in general, like, tier 11 is just a really big step up from previous rating that we've done. So, all of these fights there's no freebies. Like, in Ice Crown, we had some really easy bosses like Rotface and Gunship, and even some other bosses like Marigar and stuff like that were just like way easier than anything in this tier. So you definitely guys want to organize your raids, get some assignments going, have a plan for these bosses, because you will need it. I almost
next.
think Halfus could be an 8 too, because I think the next boss that we're gonna talk about, I think goes right in that 9 slot pretty easily.
Okay. Sure. I'll let you cook. What are you thinking goes in the 9 slot?
I think Maloriak goes there, and I've actually I've talked about this on like the Warcraft log Discord and some different places, and I've actually had some people disagree with me that this boss is harder than I think it is. But for us, it's always been a very simple, straightforward fight. It's mostly based around like the off tanks not dying to the ads and kiting them correctly, and as long as you do that, like most of the rest of the fight is pretty easy.
So I agree. When we've done this fight, it has generally gone very smoothly. I don't know if our raid is just particularly good at this encounter, or as you said, maybe the fight itself just isn't that hard. But I disagree. I don't think it's easier than Halfus. I feel like that's
Really?
too big a stretch. And here's why I think that. I think the ad tanks play a more difficult role on that fight, and it's kind of like, I mean, we'll get to this later, but I think Nefarian is one of the most difficult encounters in all of tier 11. Spoiler. But the reason for it is because the role a select couple or one person plays is so incredibly important and difficult to pull off that I think it just adds to the overall difficulty of the encounter. And if you have ad tanks that are, in this case on Maloriak, are very capable of tanking and kiting the ads in circles, using frost traps, of course, then all of a sudden that fight becomes a lot easier. But maybe you have, a hunter in your raid that's sleeping on the job and isn't consistently putting their frost trap up. All of a sudden your tank's dead, and now the raid wipes, and it's like...
I did see some guilds that were struggling on the site because like their off tanks were just like not kiting the ads well enough.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen a lot of people try to just 2-tank this fight. It's actually much easier if you use 3 tanks. Obviously, you lose the DPS, but it makes the fight a lot easier to control those ads. So, also in general, something we didn't bring up. From the start of this tier, we were saying we want to over-tank and over-heal all of these fights. We're a progression guild. That's what we care about. Like, we really don't care about like parsing and getting all 99s on the first few weeks. We just want to do the fights as safely and cleanly as we can. And almost none of these fights have DPS checks, so we are putting in as many tanks as is useful and putting in as many healers as is useful. For most fights for us, for Prog, that meant 6 healers, and any fight that we could 3-tank, we sent the 3rd tank to help out.
Which I would also generally recommend for most guilds that are progressing through the raids right now. There's throwing more tanks and more healers at these encounters makes them a lot easier most of the time. And just going back to the point about Maloriak too, one thing I do agree with you about for Maloriak being one of the easier encounters in Blackwing Descent and in this raid pool in general is that the heroic difficulty is like almost negligible, like no difference. Okay, we get ads that spawn, they get picked up by tanks that get kited around the room. The ad phase here is at the beginning of the fight, so your off tanks either won't have ads up, or they'll have 3. And it doesn't seem to be consistent between pulls. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure I've seen cases of where Maloriak will sometimes cast his release aberration, spawning 3 ads, then going into his engulfing darkness phase, and then sometimes he doesn't do it. But even if he does, it's only 3 ads, and so your tanks just kind of kite them with the vile swills, and it's like you just kill them.
It's actually a good thing if you get lucky and he does cast it, because you can just AoE them with the vile swills, and then you have 3 less ads to deal with later. But yeah, it is just RNG on whether he casts release aberrations or not, from what we've seen. It's just a window on the cooldown on the spell, and he'll sometimes cast it. He usually will.
And then once the ads are dead, the boss just like sits there and beats up your tank for a while and does literally nothing else. So like, I definitely think the heroic mode of this fight is if we're talking about steps between heroic and normal, which I'll probably put this in the title of the video or something, but we're assuming all heroic encounters, not including normals here.
Yeah, the normal modes in this whole tier are very easy. They are pretty undertuned in my opinion, even compared to like going back to previous raids like Ice Crown and stuff. Like, the gap between normal and heroic is just so huge. Normals are like pretty easy and most pugs and people can do them, and then heroics are very difficult and you need to have assignments, you need to have a plan, etc., etc.
Mm.
I think the exception being normal Nef is actually pretty hard for most raids. Actually, bring that up. I don't know if you want to pull up the actual statistics of the kills. I linked it to you in Discord if you haven't seen it, but it's
Sure.
a nice little Wowhead article showing which bosses have been killed the most. And so in this 25-man heroic kills, you'll see how many bosses have actually died. But I think a lot of times this is skewed to people just kind of going into the first raid and working on the first bosses.
Yeah.
But if you scroll down more to, I think it's like a pull per kill graph. And this one shows how many pulls on average a guild takes to kill these bosses.
Wait, that's so cool.
So actually we're right on track, and I'm not... I have seen this graph, but I'm not really going purely based on it. I'm going more just our guilds per...
Okay.
But technically we are right on track. Atramedes, Maloriak, Halfus.
Word.
And the next one actually on that graph is Chimaeron, which I actually disagree with. So.
Okay. Well, why don't we move on then? So what do you think would slot into... Hold on, let me pull this... graph back up. So we have Atramedes, Maloriak, Halfus. I'm gonna side with the general population of people that don't think Maloriak is easier than Halfus, despite the graph showing contrary. I'm gonna put it with Halfus, but
sure, yeah. I mean, these first few bosses are all kind of close in general.
Yeah, I agree. So what do you think goes next?
So next you kind of have a choice. The next three, if I'm kind of putting them in like groups, would be Omnitron Defense System, Magmaw, and Chimaeron.
Okay.
Chimaeron is very, very much based on your tanks and healers. It's pretty much just a tank and healer fight, and the DPS are just kind of there to sit there and do a patchwork DPS fight. So it really kind of depends on your raid group. If you have really good tanks and healers, maybe Chimaeron is actually easier. And if you have more of a DPS oriented raid and your DPS are really good, but your tank and healers kind of mess up sometimes, then I think these other fights might be easier.
Yeah, so that is Chimaeron, and I also agree with your initial assessment where it's like this fight is made a lot easier with good tanks and healers, as your DPS really aren't doing a whole lot this fight. It's kind of like the patchwork style of encounter. So if I'm gonna rank this one, Chimaeron, and we'll talk about Magmaw and Omnitron Defense System afterwards. I agree. I do think this is a more difficult encounter. Although I don't think it's like that big a jump. I would probably just put it in 7 and leave it there for now.
Yeah. I think 7's a good spot. I could maybe see 6, but it's around there. And I think these next two bosses are right around there as well, too.
Here, actually, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to rank the next two bosses where I think they fall, and then I want you to give me your feedback and see if you agree with where I place them. So I would put Omnitron Defense System equally in 7, and I'll put Magmaw in 6.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with this.
Okay. Actually, I didn't think you would, but all right.
Magmaw is interesting because it's not too hard of a fight mechanically, but it's such a big healing check, and it's so early in the raid that you really need your healers to be on top of their shit, or else this fight falls apart so fast.
100%. It's kind of funny too, being the first boss. It's like if you're showing up to raid for the day, and you're like, all right, I'm gonna, I just got home from work. I'm gonna shake off the rust. Warm up on some of the easier encounters, and you're a healer being tossed into Magmaw. Like, good luck. That is not the fight to warm up on.
I think this is the first fight where you really, really need to have healing cooldowns. A lot of people use MRT notes or just a different assignment sheet. But it's just so important to have cooldowns for every single lava spew, because it really does just melt the raid if you're not using big healing cooldowns for that ability. And then in addition, there's just a lot of other raid damage going out if your range is not really good at dodging. The meteors coming down and the lava pillars spawning. It's going to be pretty hard.
All right, that's Magmaw. So then the last one I threw in the tier list without talking about was Omnitron Defense System. So this is like the council encounter in Blackwing Descent. It's kind of like mechanic vomit. I don't know. There are like 1,000 different mechanics that nobody knows exactly how each one works.
I do.
Okay, yeah, sure. Well, there's an exception. I mean, well, so do I, since I made the guide. But
Sure, but yeah, you're right. Most people, even in our raids, like probably don't know what half the mechanics do, or like they probably do, but like they don't know the specifics on them.
And for the most part, like it's none of the there are few mechanics that are like really, really lethal. They're just a bunch of like small noise things, but there are a few mechanics that I think are worth emphasizing. I think of things like, firstly, the shields, okay? We need to swap to the newest add all the time. The one that reaches 50 energy will proc a shield that and these shields have like super nasty effects. So if anyone turns their brain off and like keeps hitting the golem, especially if it's Magmatron, it will more than likely wipe the raid. So be mindful.
Yeah, definitely the shields is what wipes the raid. And majority of Omnitron wipes, I believe. They're just all so completely deadly and will wipe your raid if you keep attacking the wrong target. So, like Shindig said, anytime a new robot comes out, just switch to it. That's the simplest way to do it. Like, everyone make sure you call, like, okay, everyone switch to Electron, everyone switch to Electron. Like, call it out multiple times, make sure everyone knows which boss we're hitting. And in addition to the players hitting it, you have to make sure you get all of the pets, and fire elementals, stuff like that. Make sure you get that off the old robots as well.
Yeah. Otherwise, I think, for the most part, even if you don't understand what's going on, you can kind of react to what's happening and like make these decisions on the fly. Yeah. Which I think makes this fight a little bit easier and why we have it lower on the list.
I also think this is a very big raid leader carry fight. Some fights you need good tanks and healers, some fights you need good DPS, some fights you need good raid leaders. A raid leader calling everything that's going on this mechanic vomit fight, like you said, really helps out. So like if someone gets the shadow infusion, it can be pretty confusing because it says lightning infusion and then after it says like shadow infusion, like on the weak auras and add-ons.
Yeah.
So some people like freak out and they start running away from the raid. So it's like I'm like sitting there watching for that person and be like, okay, you need to stack up. So they know. And they have time to like react to my call and stack in so they make sure they don't kill the raid. So yeah, like I'd call Chimaeron like a big tank fight, Magmaw a big healing fight, and Omnitron a big raid leader fight. So it's kind of 3 different variations of fights that's really dependent on your raid that are all similar in difficulty.
I was just thinking, do you want to rank these left to right? I wasn't even thinking about that.
Yeah, I think in general. I kind of think it's like a cop-out when people just like put a bunch of bosses on the same tier or a bunch of districts on the same tier, and they're just like, oh yeah, they're all B tier.
Okay. In that case, I would put Omnitron Defense System as slightly easier than Chimaeron. I do think that, but I mean, you could make an argument for either way. And this just goes back to what you were talking about, where like Magmaw's a healer fight, Chimaeron's a tank and healer fight, Omnitron Defense System is like raid lead check / mechanic check.
Mechanic check.
It depends. If you have like certain strengths in your raid team, maybe you'll have a different experience with these fights, right? If you have really strong healers, maybe Magmaw is like infinitely easier for you guys than Chimaeron and the Omnitron Defense System. So it's context dependent, right? But in general, I think this is cool.
Yeah. And then like we said, you do have to kill Magmaw and Omnitron before you can go to the rest of BWD. So if you want to kill them on heroic, like you have to decide at the beginning if you're working on them on heroic or if you're skipping them and going to normal.
Right.
So really, like I'd say work on them before Chimaeron because then you have an option as opposed to like you do, let's say you do Omnitron on normal, but then you go and kill the rest of the bosses and you have extra time. You can't go back to Omnitron.
Right. Good point. Also, if you spend too much time on these first 2 bosses and you don't get to do Atramedes, I mean, shit out of luck.
I actually have seen like some pug raids and guild raids like do that where they just spend all their time wiping on Magmaw or Omnitron and then they don't get to like the easier bosses afterwards. Alright, I think those are all the like easy to mid-level bosses of the raid.
Yeah.
And the rest are a step up.
I agree. What do you think goes next? And actually, before you answer that question, whatever boss you would select as the next option, or of all the bosses available, I would almost, maybe except for one I'm thinking of, I think all of them belong in a tier above 5. There's one I'm kind of on the fence about.
Yeah, I think we're probably thinking about the same one, Valiona and Theralion.
No, that's not the one I'm thinking about.
Interesting.
I'm thinking about Conclave.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, Conclave is a tricky one. It's kind of like Omnitron Defense System, where it's like very mechanic based, like very, um, like as long as you make sure you know everything you're doing. The weird part about Conclave, and we talked about this a little bit, is the loot. The loot is all random. What suffixes you get on Conclave.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times you can get some like really bad RNG loot, or like 3 male belts that you don't need type thing.
Yeah, that is true. So, I mean, progression wise, maybe you hold off if loot is a bigger priority. I mean, I'm not super aware of loot, but I am aware of the fact that the Throne of the Four Winds bosses have like these random roll items, which can be a little weird. Does Alakir also have that?
He does, but they're generally better, and he also drops a bunch of tier if you kill him on heroic.
Okay, that's right. He does do that.
The tier is like guaranteed.
Well, I mean, let me make my case for Conclaves and why I think it's like the next step. It's the next easiest of the available bosses we have left. So Conclave's difficulty level, as you touched on briefly, is just how many different things are going on, how many different roles need to happen over the course of the fight. But it's like, in my opinion, if you can have one person on each platform that understands the fight and knows how things work, they can basically, there's pretty much like 3 different fights going on. I mean, you could maybe make a case and say there's more because of maybe 1 or 2 people have extra roles. Like if you have a 3rd tank, they're going to be jumping across early and kind of doing their own thing. But each of the roles on the platforms, like as a melee DPS on the Wind platform, I'm just hitting the boss, I jump over, I hit another boss, I jump back, and then I just repeat that until the bosses are dead. And it's kind of like, it's because this is a boss encounter, each of the Jin have like less abilities than any average boss or any average fight. So they're not like inherently difficult on each one of the platforms, but there is some trickery here, and the reason why they're not lower on the tier list, we haven't included them yet. I think the biggest like difficulty curve for this encounter is on the nature platform, and having good tanks and DPS that are able to kill the adds in a reasonable time before the tank basically falls over. Now, I'm not usually on that platform, so I'm kind of curious to hear what maybe your experience with that is, but as a melee DPS that's often on a different platform doing my own thing, picking my nose, hitting the boss, it's just learn the mechanics and it kind of just falls over. I don't know.
I actually think I disagree. I feel like we've had more issues on the Wind platform than any other platform. Mostly based on like the shield and the frontal knockback. I do think like the tank and or kiter on the nature platform is very important, but overall I'd say the Wind platform is where we have most of our issues.
Okay, so you say that. I don't think the issues we have are because the Wind platform is like hard to do though. Like from pole to pole, what ends up happening, and I think
it's hard to coordinate.
Yeah, I guess, but the problem is like, I imagine the reason you're saying this is because when melee DPS need to jump back from the blue platform to the Wind platform, or the frost platform to the Wind platform, we're worried about the Wind blast, and if we get there too late, we miss the shield, right? Like that's the point you're going for.
Yeah.
So the thing is, like, that's the boss. The Wind boss doesn't use Wind blast at like the same time after every ultimate. It's like random, or it's not consistent. Again. Or at least what we've been doing is we have one tank that sits. It's usually the like main frost tank that jumps over during the Wind dude's ultimate, and then communicates to the rest of our raid, hey, all right, Wind blast is going out now, you guys can jump back soon, or jump back now, or no, you can't jump back, we're waiting for Wind blast, because we've had polls where Wind blast is going out and people jump back right into it and then just get knocked off the platform, right? That's what we're trying to avoid. But you can have some polls where like Wind blast just doesn't get casted, and you have all the melee DPS waiting to jump back, and it doesn't go out until like the boss reaches 20-25 energy. So by the time you do actually get back, you're having to run into the boss during a shield and you just don't make it. So like, I feel like that maybe there are ways you can outplay this that I'm not aware of, but I think it's just kind of like a luck-based thing from on a pull-by-pull basis. So like if you just have a really unlucky pull, just go again, and more odds are that you won't have to think about it twice. Eventually this boss will just fall over.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say it is RNG like when he casts the spell, but I think good raids will always be able to play around RNG. So let's say he doesn't cast it right away, you can call to the melee to come over right away, or if he does cast it right away, then you can wait type thing and just be ready to jump over as soon as it ends, so you still have enough time to do the shield mechanic. I don't think this fight is necessarily hard, especially when everyone knows what they're doing, knows their role, knows where they're going, and knows what they need to do. But I do think all of that together gives it enough coordination requirement that I'd say it is harder than Valion and Theralion to me.
Okay, so let's tell me about Valiona and Theralion then.
So Valion and Theralion is the second boss in Bastion of Twilight after Halfus Formbreaker. It's a twin dragon fight where you just fight one dragon at a time and then they swap. And there's usually an intermission between that can be pretty deadly. The hard mechanic about this fight really is the Twilight Zone. So there's a few mechanics that can send you into the Twilight Zone, and you have to go down there occasionally because a bunch of ads are spawning down there, and they are just shooting your raid constantly if they're not killed. So you have to send some DPS and healers down there to kill the ads so that they don't wipe your raid. And they're called Rift Sentries, and they just kind of slowly build up over time. So you really need to send people down there, kill those Rift Sentries, and come back up. The problem is, down there is really chaotic, and you usually only have like 1 or 2 healers assigned to go down there to help heal the DPS, but the DPS are all spread out. There's you have to be dodging the mechanics that are down there, which are these like floating orbs that will almost one-shot you if you get hit by one. And then in addition to all that, you also have to be dodging the stuff that's going on up top in the normal realm. So this Twilight Realm really is the crutch of the fight. And if you can get that down, the rest of the fight and mechanics aren't too bad, although it still is a lot of raid damage going up top, and people have to be doing the correct things for the correct mechanics. So there's some mechanics you have to spread out for, some mechanics you have to stack in for. Some people get confused on those things. Yeah, what do you think about the fight? You're one of the main like Twilight team goers, so how do you feel about it?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, Twilight Realm is crazy deadly. So like, if I remember correctly, back when it was being tested, like when you guys were testing on the beta, the Twilight Rift ads, the Twilight Sentries, I don't believe they would channel their Rift Blast on people in the Twilight Realm. Like they just never did it. Or
the other thing is those orbs did not move at all. They were stationary.
Ah, okay. So yeah, that would definitely add
much easier on beta, but they fixed that.
That would definitely add to the ease. So like in I think it was on our very first kill when this on live, I died on our kill and I had to get B-res regrettably. But the reason I died was I was down below in the Twilight Zone, and I basically cloaked at about 15 stacks, and I was like, oh, I have recuperate up. I'm at about half health, but I'm not gonna be taking any damage from the environment. It's like ticking damage, but when you're at low stacks, it's very, very low. So I'm like, I'm fine. I'm just gonna milk this and kill some ads. And I just got Rift Blasted for like my entire health bar over the course of 2 seconds, and I had no portals near me, and I just fell over. So, like, if you get targeted down below and there are no healers in your proximity, or maybe they've gone up themselves in the portal, you're kind of like, if you don't have a really strong defensive, you're kind of out of luck. So you have to play that like very safe and basically minimize the amount of time you're down there. I feel like that's one big thing that's changed for us as we've re-cleared this, is just like spending less time in the Twilight Realm. And have you tried to send more people down, or?
Yeah, in general, we're sending more people down now than we were like the first few weeks, because we realized it's better just to send more people down there, kill like 1 or 2 ads, and then jump back up. Right.
If you don't take care of them, they will eventually just rot out your raid. And that's, I guess, why I mentioned I would put Conclave first. So the Twilight Realm being as difficult as it is contributes to part of that, but also kind of like Magmaw, I think the raid healing requirement on this fight is like extremely high, and surprisingly so. If you're
It's pretty interesting. If people are doing the mechanics correctly, we actually don't take much damage. Like, you know how when we start phase 1, like, it feels like nothing's going on for a while, right?
Mhm.
It's the same phase 1 when we get it the second time. It just feels more chaotic because, like, we're usually down people or, like, someone, like, messes up a mechanic.
So, and I think that's like the problem though, is that there are a lot of mechanics on this fight that are like personal responsibility, where if you don't get out with engulfing magic, oh, the raid's dead. Or I think this is like a very the first, I think, big choke point during this encounter is during the like first phase transition. So while you're fighting Valiona, Theralion's going to begin casting Dazzling Destruction. So unless you're assigned to going to the Twilight Realm, you know, everyone's running around the place trying to avoid these swirlies, moving with the boss. During all of that, Valiona's going to use one last, what is the big...
It's a blackout.
Blackout, that's right. And that blackout is deadly. Like and this is something that we had during progression, right? Melee, so we get blackout away from like the center of the room, Valiona flies away, Theralion goes down, all the melee charge into the boss, and then whoever's left on the outside with blackout just gets like blasted. So that's...
You have to like stay calm and stay coordinated even during the chaotic parts of this fight, which is usually during the intermission. I actually think on your VOD here right now, we're gonna get that exact combat you were saying.
Okay.
We actually played it really well tonight, but we have messed it up in the past.
I do remember
this
now.
is Dazzling Destruction, where we get a bunch of swirls. And as we're running around, everyone's spreading out to dodge these things. We get a blackout on Kroggy here. And I call everyone stack on the tank, stack on the tank, stack on the tank. So Krog comes over, he has a skull on his head, and we all stack up together, and we eat this blackout together, and it makes it less deadly. But if everyone just tries to like run back over to the boss and everyone's spreading out, like that blackout can very easily kill a bunch of people.
So anyways, that's my case. Honestly, after talking with you about it, I think I'm less convinced that Conclave is the easier fight. I was thinking, I've been watching a lot of this on 10-man. I think Valiona and Theralion is absolutely brutal on 10-man, but
That's actually a good point. We generally do all 25-mans in our guild and raids. We don't have a ton of experience with 10-man other than like watching people's VODs and other stuff. So anything we've been talking about, this is all for 25-man heroic for the most part. Yeah,
and I'm gonna stick to the 25-man angle. I think that is valid.
But yeah, I think both these bosses are very different, and they're both, like we said, a decent step up in difficulty from the last ones.
So I would be happy putting these in 4, and I've been convinced if we want to put Conclave more difficult, I think that's fair. Unless you think this is a not big enough distinguished
tier list, though. I think we need to bump all of these down.
I was thinking the same thing actually. So
yeah,
I would probably do this. Go from 8 to 9 and then everything else down 1.
Yeah, just bump down 1. Yep.
Okay.
But I still agree with that gap, and then these 2 on 5.
Okay, what comes next?
Let's see. What do we have left? We have Ascendant Council and the 3 end bosses, right?
And Cho'gall, if you count that. Yeah. You can also count that as a boss, kind of, but
right. I'd almost want to throw out a curveball because of how easy it was tonight, and say Alec here is next. What do you think about that?
Whoa, that is okay. Well, you know what? I'll cook with it. Let's. I'll hear you out. I'll hear you out here.
At least for us on our re-clears of this fight, and we just progressed it in one of our splits. We actually had a very easy time with this on all of our kills. Even our progression kill was actually, I think, very few pulls on it. Obviously, we did a lot of PTR testing and beta testing, but our actual progression kills, live kills of it, was very few pulls. And then on all of our re-clears, it's been like 1 or 2 shot. And then on our prog in our split tonight was, I think, a 2 shot, right?
Yeah, I don't remember 3 attempts. I can check here, but 2 pulls. Yep.
Yeah, this is a really fun fight. It's kind of interesting. Most fights start easy and then they get harder as the phases of progress. I think Alakir is one of the few fights that's the opposite, where it's really hard phase 1, phase 2 is like middle, and then phase 3 is completely free if you know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the phase 1 is definitely challenging though. There's a lot of things that can kill you. We again opt to overheal this fight in most of our raids. So on progression we used up to 8 healers, which is a very high number. But it's really just about surviving this phase 1. There's a lot of deadly mechanics going on. You have to have a plan, you have to have assignments, you have to have assigned spots for all of your raid members. But once you get this phase 1 down and like you live through this phase 1, and of course gear, we're getting a lot more gear each week. I think this fight is kind of made a lot easier with gear more than other fights, because it's just about like surviving this phase 1. So with our more gear, with more DPS, with more healing, more stamina from our gear, it's making that staying alive part a lot easier, which is like the hardest part of the fight.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. I'm actually surprised how much easier this encounter feels with gear. Or maybe it's just maybe it's unrelated to gear and we're just like infinitely better now than we were when we started progressing this fight. But yeah, I agree. In our like re-clears, it definitely feels like this boss just kind of falls over. With phase 1 being the most difficult part of the encounter. And it's just like phase 1 is a big mechanic check. If you can survive, you will win. And that's pretty much the fight. And I was wondering, so we lust during phase 2. Do you think for raid teams progressing this encounter, would make more sense to lust phase 1 to make it shorter?
Yeah, that's a good point. We actually needed the lust in phase 2 to survive for initial progression, but maybe with our now increased DPS we wouldn't need it. You do get more out of the lust in phase 2 though, because he has a multiplier on him.
Right.
He can take more damage in phase 2, so that multiplies with lust to get even more damage out of it. But yeah, definitely with more gear it could be an option. We haven't tried it ourselves, but that could work.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would. I think it's a less optimal way to kill the boss, but it's like safer if the goal is just trying to get out of phase 1. Also, I get hit by a squall line. That's good. I kind of thought we were wiping here, so I like stopped kind of running, and then
we were pretty much wiped at this point.
But yeah. So yeah, gut reaction is like, wait, Alakir being this high up, or being next?
I didn't really think about it too much before tonight, because we actually did not do this order like in our splits, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But in hindsight, I think this might have been an easier fight than some of the other ones.
So okay, I do think I agree with everything you said. I don't know if I would put Alakir as a more difficult or less difficult fight than Cho'gall, which for me would be the next thing I would consider. I think
Ascendant Council is also in the mix, I think.
I think Ascendant Council is more difficult than both of these fights, Alakir and Cho'gall. The reason I say that is because, well, a couple things. So let's first talk about Cho'gall. Cho'gall is the final boss in Bash of Twilight Normal, or second final on Heroic.
I also think, if you don't mind just showing, if we can go back a little bit to that Alakir.
Sure.
If you just show this phase 3 of Alakir, if you can find it real quick. Some raids have some difficulty in this phase. Oh, are you on the backside? You little rascal.
I never die. I just make sure if I'm low in health, I'll run back to the raid.
Alright, well, it won't be a very good point of view, but you can live in this phase pretty much forever. There's no ramping damage, there's no enrage check. If you do the mechanics correctly, you can be in this phase pretty much forever. As long as you have like enough healers to like keep everyone alive, like it's actually crazy free. Let's move on to Cho'gall.
Sure. Cho'gall, this dude feels like it has like 1 billion health. This is a long encounter, if I can find it.
It's because you have to like put so much damage into ads and
yeah. So
we actually do this in kind of a boomer way. We pretty much just say all ads are full priority over boss. If there are any ads alive, you have to be hitting the ads, which does make the fight longer for us, but it also makes it safer.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of guilds will just like passive cleave like the elementals instead of like full swapping to them, stuff like that. So there's definitely a few different ways you can do it and go about this fight.
Yeah, so I think the difficulty points here, I think the first phase, so from 100 to 25%, it's like the boss doesn't have that many mechanics. You kind of just like sit there and slap him up, but you have to always worry about ads. So as Moon mentioned, in our case, we are basically like always full send the ads, which I will not do a great example of, as I have been did on the boss and stay on him. But there are certain moments where it's more important than others. In particular, when the corrupting adherence spawn, being able to have, you know, the range DPS finish off the adherence as they're running out, while melee take care of any elemental ads that spawn. Because it's during these overlaps where you're likely to have a case where, oh, oops, we didn't hit the shadow ad. Now the boss has like a billion AoE damage he's going to smack the raid with. And I would say another probably difficulty point in phase 1 is like correct ad management. Being able to have good interrupts on the ads, avoiding standing the corrupting crashes, cleaving them down fast enough before the boss uses Fester Blood. Like, these are all small things, but once the ad management is good, phase 1 just kind of becomes automatic. But yeah, having
ad management and interrupt management are just so important on this fight.
Yeah. But it's not something where like, and I think what makes this encounter hard is like, it's not, I don't think any of those things we just mentioned are like inherently that difficult. But the problem is like, if you make one mistake, you are punished hard in phase 2. Because let's say if you have the raid entering phase 2 with like 30 corruption instead of 10 or 0, all of a sudden you have like a lot less time to kill the boss, and you're dealing with a lot more raid damage.
Right, you have like 8 people like puking on each other.
Yeah, it just cascades. So like, you kind of, to progress this boss, you kind of need to be like perfect in phase 1, which I think is what makes it difficult.
One small note talking about difficulty on this boss is Horde actually have a much easier job on this boss for one of the mechanics. Mind controls 5 random people in the raid, and they have to be interrupted or silenced or CC'd in some way to get them out of the mind control. Horde have 2 races with racials that do an AoE stun or silence with the Blood Elf and Tauren. Alliance, we do not have that. We actually end up opting in to use a Destruction Warlock, and they use Shadow Fury to stun us all out of the mind control. But it does stun us for longer, and it's, in general, just a little more annoying to have to do that.
Mm-hmm. That's actually a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. But going back into phase 2, so
this phase is chaotic.
Yeah. Yeah.
One thing I'll say for this fight is the boss dies at like 2.5%, which is kind of weird. Like, he'll start walking towards the middle.
Yeah, just like that.
As soon as he starts walking, like, that means you've killed the boss, even if all your raid dies. Which means this is one of those fights where we just never give up. We never call a wipe if we're in this phase. We just send everything as much as we can, as much as we got. In general, this boss, I think, took some time for all, like, our progression raid and our splits to progress. I personally think it's harder than Alakir, now that I've like seen them all a few times. I think Cho'gall has really big ad management requirement, interrupt requirements. You have to. One thing that did help us, by the way, what we learned is Ellie and Enhanced Shamans can both spec into very short cooldown off the GCD interrupts, and they can pretty much solo interrupt an ad by themselves. So if you have good shamans, and they can get almost every single interrupt on the adherence, which really help out the raid requirements and interrupt requirements, stuff like that. But even with that, I think personally I'd still rate this harder. I think I'd put this right out of 3.
Yeah,
I mean, feel free to disagree.
I'm thinking about it. I don't know.
Yeah, a lot of these fights in this tier are just like very different. They're hard to like directly compare, you know?
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. This didn't translate to the live version, but because of how much time we spent progressing Alakir on the beta, or I can't in good conscience put it a full tier below Cho'gall. Like that's kind of where I'm coming from. Because I think maybe now with better
It also depends
information.
on the gear, right?
Yeah.
Like, in lower gear levels, I'd agree that Alakir was harder.
Another thing I would add that I think has made a big difference is when we were on the beta. We didn't know as much about the fight that we do now, which I mean is true for most encounters, but like you think of Cataclysm raids, you think, okay, well, all the information is already out there. It exists, everything's been solved. Which is like,
Yeah, it's really not.
which I mean, I would say in general it's true, but a lot of these things happened 15 years ago. A lot of it gets lost. There aren't great ways to like find this information again. And also like the skill level of players now versus then is like many times different. The way people play the game is way different. So there's a lot of like small nuances that we kind of had to figure out. And I think a really good example of that is like, I don't know, how long did it take until we started having like the people in the different stacks for lightning charge like run different directions. Like I feel like that was a big quality of life change. Or knowing that like, okay, we cannot spawn the lightning strike in between two marks. That is what's wiping us. Like being able to identify exactly those issues took us a long time. And like, had we known that from the get-go, I think I would agree. And I'd say like, yeah, Alakir is an easier encounter, but I also think these things aren't necessarily like intuitive for a lot of red groups, and that information is like not that readily available. I mean, if you see my guide, it is, but like that's kind of my hesitation there.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, anyways, I would do. I could settle for something like this, but
Okay,
let me hear what you have to say about Ascendant Council, because maybe that'll move some things around.
Yeah, Ascendant Council is interesting. Going back to loot, like we talked a little bit about on Conclave, Ascendant Council has some of the worst loot in the tier from any boss. There is like maybe 1.5 bis items from Ascendant Council. So we've actually opted to completely skip Ascendant Council in our splits and different raids. And just completely ignore them because the loot is just like not worth the effort we want to put in for like a reasonably hard boss. Now with that being said, I don't think this boss is that hard. I think Ascendant Council is probably maybe one above those other two fights. Ascendant Council is an interesting fight. It's in 3 different phases. You fight 2 of the council members, then you fight the other 2 council members, and then phase 3 is they all merge together. But the phase 1 is pretty chill.
No, I agree, actually, thinking about it more. But phase 2 is not the
Phase 2
same.
is when it gets really, really chaotic.
Yeah.
So you have these tornadoes and these gravity wells, which you can both see on the screen here. And you start by having to get a tornado debuff, so you have to run into the tornado. You get this tornado debuff. And then the boss will do a mechanic that if you don't have the tornado debuff, you just get one shot.
Or in this case, this is the heroic mechanic. If you're being pursued by a frozen orb and you're not able to get away, meaning you get hit, the raid wipes. And there's no way around that. So that makes this phase brutal.
Pretty much you're bouncing between these 2 different debuffs that you need, running around trying to get them. You have to be running away from frost orbs, you have to be dodging flame strikes, you have to be, if you get a lightning orb, you have to get out of the raid. The bosses are doing like casts, you have to interrupt. There's pretty much just so much going on in this phase all at once. It's like one of the most chaotic phases of the tier. And you really have to know the mechanics well to make sure that you are not dying to them.
It's interesting because this is the third boss of the raid, right? Okay, if we think of third bosses, well, Throne doesn't have any third bosses, but in Blackwing Descent, you have like an option, right? You have Maloriak, you have Chimaeron, you have all the Atramedes. Like none of those fights come remotely close to just a sheer amount of mechanics, personal responsibility, and like difficulty that's associated with this fight, which is.
And even thinking about like previous raids, like Ice Crown, you had like Gun
yeah.
Arfang, Ulduar, you had Kolagarn, you know.
Yeah, it's a crazy step up in difficulty. So if you arrive at this boss, you're like, damn, it's the third boss of the raid, and like we're struggling this much. Don't feel bad. This fight is just Splatoon crazy hard.
Yeah. That actually brings up a decent point. Not only are you progressing these bosses in different orders, you have to think about like which raids you're going into and like which order you're doing the raids in, because you don't want to be traveling back and forth to these different raids to like progress different bosses in some weird order.
Yeah.
So that is something you have to think. So in general, like Bastion of Twilight is, except for Halfus, is harder than almost all of BWD.
Mhm.
So a lot of times, like starting in BWD is a good place, and you like try to get 5 out of 6 BWD. You get one boss in Bastion of Twilight. Maybe you go do Conclave. But other than that, like you just focus on like the BWD heroics, and then you do the rest on normal.
Mhm.
Early on, anyway. Once you get to like 9 out of 13, 10 out of 13, then you like just have to start working on the bosses individually, of course. Anyway, so even after you get through phase 2 on this fight, this phase 3 is a really big DPS burn phase. Again, probably a lot easier. Well, it is a lot easier now that we have more gear. But it is still a pretty tight DPS check that you have to be pumping for, and the healers have to heal a lot. There's a lot of AoE raid damage going on at the same time. And again, this is after I said at the beginning, the loot from this boss is really bad. There's like 1 bis strength cloak and maybe 1 bis like healer offhand. The rest of the loot from this boss is just not bis for pretty much any spec. And it's a pretty hard fight in itself, just without thinking about the loot.
Mhm.
So I would definitely avoid doing this boss until very late. We are even considering in our splits just doing it last, which is crazy to think about. But like we would just rather spend our time working on the other bosses.
Right.
But I think it's solidly harder than, at least for me, I'd say solidly harder than Alakir. I think it's around the same as Cho'gall. So from your tier list, if you want to pull it back up, I'd probably, like I said, for me, I'd put Cho'gall 1 higher and then put Ascendant Council with this one. But I definitely respect that you think Cho'gall is a little bit easier.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like just the amount of personal responsibility involved for this fight, I'd have to leave Ascending Council out higher, but potentially when we get to our 1 and 2s, maybe I could.
The
We'll
only
see.
thing that I'm thinking about is like phase 1 is pretty chill as long as you're interrupting Ice Lance and you're like not dying to glaciate. And then phase 3 with gear, I think, will be pretty easy for most people once they are already on this boss,
See,
they've killed all the bosses before this.
You say that, but like, and this is the final point I was going to make. I mean, when we re-cleared this last week with better gear, we were barely killing the boss. Like it, maybe,
Yeah.
I mean, sure, we were messing up maybe some mechanics along the way. We didn't have as many DPS. It's still a tight window, and it hasn't become that much easier as I would have thought
Right.
it would.
It definitely has not become free.
Like I would make a comparison to Alakir. I think Alakir has become a lot easier with gear. Now maybe it's not gear that's made that fight easier, but like comparatively, again, Ascendant Council just seems to be a lot more difficult. So yeah. I'll tell you what, I'll do this. We'll put Cho'gall with Ascendant Council in 3. We leave Alakir in 4, but I have to keep Ascendant Council higher. Okay, final 2 bosses of the tier. Wait, what order are we placing them?
Yeah, I think this is definitely Sinestra at 2, Nefarian at 1.
I agree.
Yeah, these are both really fun fights, really hard fights. Nef, I think, is an interesting one because there's one job in particular on that fight that takes so much responsibility, and it's like the main way you wipe on Nefarian. The rest of the fight is still pretty hard, but that one job is just like so important that it makes or breaks the fight completely.
Yeah.
But let's talk about Sinestra first, since we're ranking that a tiny bit easier. Sinestra is a pretty fun fight. There is a main mechanic here that everyone needs to get really good at, or else it will be a doomed progression, and that is Twilight Cutters, Twilight Slicers.
Yep.
But these come out pretty often, and they're in a bulk of the fight, which is phase 1 and phase 3, and they just will instantly kill anyone that messes them up. Not only the person that gets the orb has to pay attention and get out really quickly, anyone that doesn't get the orb has to move away from them to make sure they're safe. So it's like personal responsibility on both sides, and if the person that is getting chased with the orb dies, the orb will just go in like a random direction and probably wipe the raid. So that's really bad. But in general, like, you need all your DPS alive for this fight. We can't have early deaths in this fight. We need everyone to make all the rest of the DPS checks in this fight. I like this fight because it has something going for everyone. It's like it's a tank fight, it's a healer fight, it's a DPS fight.
Sinestra is a lot of fun. And I fully agree. It's like challenging in kind of every aspect. Now it's not challenging in all the aspects because we have a different boss ranked above it, but it's there's a lot going on, many mechanics. It's a multi-phase fight. There's a lot of things your raid will have to contend with over the course of the encounter that need to be dealt with correctly. Twilight Cutters being a big one in phase 1. In phase 2 especially, being able to survive Flame Breath, especially for players affected by rack. There can be some pretty nasty overlaps, so you basically always want to have raid defensive cooldown coverage or healing cooldowns lined up for these big hits that go out. And I mentioned phase 3 because the boss is no longer doing reduced damage that it was doing in phase 1. And so it can lead some like very intense moments where your entire raid is like below 30% health and there are multiple people with rack. It's like super engaging. Healers are engaged. DPS are trying to blast the boss with Essence of the Red, which is a ton of fun to play with. Just having, is it like 100% increased haste? It's some percent of haste. Mana. Yeah, and unlimited mana. You're just blasting like full capacity.
I guess it doesn't affect your energy, but the haste does, right?
Yeah, haste increases energy regen. So I mean, I'm just constantly using abilities, which feels great as assassination.
Oh, one thing I'll say for this fight and for the next fight, like the two hardest fights in the raid, Unholy Decays are actually insane on these two fights. Not only are they one of the top DPS anyway, which makes them really good, but they actually have the best utility and defensive in the raid pretty much, in Anti-Magic Zone. Which is funny because some of the Unholy DK guides don't even recommend taking it, which is insane. Anti-Magic Zone, for anyone that doesn't know, it's on a 2-minute cooldown. It puts up this purple orb on you, and it reduces magic damage taken by 75% up to a cap of like a certain number. I forget the number exactly. But what's so insane about this ability is that if all of the damage happens all at once, which happens with like Flame Breath and Crackle in the next fight, it'll just fully reduce all of that by 75%. But you actually just run out of raid cooldowns only using healing cooldowns on these fights. So having extra cooldowns from the Unholy Decays, from like the Warrior's Rallying Cry, really helps out. And even like using like, let's say if you have a Boomkin or a Shadow Priest, like using their hymns and shrinks will really help out also.
But okay, that's Sinestra. So then that brings us to the final and number one most difficult fight in this tier, Nefarian and Onyxia.
Yeah, Nefarian. So as we alluded to before, this fight is mostly hard. I mean, the whole fight's kind of hard, but the real difficulty really ramps up in phase 3. And like we alluded to, like one person has this very specific role that is just so important to the raid, and that's your off tank, which whoever is tanking the ads. These ads are just extremely deadly. If they ever get loose, or if they ever kill your tank, or if they ever stay alive too long, you will wipe. It's just instant death, pretty much. But let's start at the beginning. So there are some difficulties in this phase, but in general, as long as you have like a general idea of what you're doing, you have some cooldowns for the early crackles. Crackle is an ability that happens every 10%, and it just does a huge thunder strike to your entire raid. So having cooldowns for these really helps, and specifically preventative damage cooldowns. So like we said, AMZ is really good here. Power Word Barrier is really good here. Especially if you don't have Unholy Decays, like there's some of these crackles where you just have to eat with nothing, and it can very easily one-shot people if they're like it does about like 80% of your health. So if they're like at 80% health, when the crackle goes out, they're just gonna die.
Right. Something I'll add too, which is a little interesting, and I think there are people out there that could make an argument, say, hey, I think Sinestra is a more difficult encounter than Nefarian. And I think they would have a case for that, because I'll say as a DPS on this fight, I'm not really that worried. I mean, well, I play a rogue, so I get to press feint every crackle, which reduces that damage by half. Otherwise I'm just kind of hitting the boss, and like my role is, it's a lot less like crucial. You can get mind controlled and have like damage windows, and that's kind of fun to play around, but On Sinestra, it feels like you're like racing. You're in a race to kill the boss against like the timer that is your Essence of the Red buff, that is the Bloodlust that comes after that. If the boss isn't dead by then, okay, you're out of resources. The room's being flooded with pools. Oh, shit, we're gonna all die. I feel like that you get more of that impression on Sinestra. However, that also exists in Nefarian, although you don't really feel it as a player. But
it's more of like a race to see how long your tank can live.
Yeah. There's one player in your raid that's definitely feeling it, and that's the tank. And like that is just, for me at least, that's why this is the most difficult encounter in the tier. It's just your tank or tanks are playing their own separate game, just sweating buckets, like trying to navigate, surviving the ads, making it so that they don't get in contact with any of the fire. You notice at the right of the screen here, there's fire on the ground. If any of the animated bone warriors get in contact with that fire, it refreshes their energy bar, which prolongs the amount of time they spend alive. And then the longer they're alive, they get this ramping damage buff that will basically just eventually one-shot your tank. So it's a race to kill Nefarian before your tanks die. And if your tanks don't know what this is doing, you will spend a long time on this boss.
I think what's interesting about this boss too is it actually scales with your gear somewhat. The faster you kill the boss, the more crackles go off because it's based on his health, which can actually be pretty deadly, especially if you end up like doing it like way too fast and then you don't have cooldowns for the crackles. So that could be something to worry about in the future, like having all of these crackles go off.
Right. You see one go off there, and the entire raid gets brought to like almost no health. The crackle can one-shot players, like fairly low eye level players, without a cooldown. I know we had a case where Wrestler Druid would like just get absolutely one shot when we were practicing this on the beta, which was crazy to me that there are mechanics in Classic that just like hit the entire raid for that much
just
damage.
Straight up one shot you.
Yeah, like it's not even like a pass fail mechanic. You just AoE damage that blast. So coordinating cooldowns, making sure no awkward overlaps. Also, as the main tank here, I mean, Moon, you're often in this role. Make sure the boss is faced in the correct direction, away from the other ad tanks, and the rest of the raid isn't positioned in fire. These are all things that you need to think about. Where if for 1 second you like lose track of that, I mean, you're just dead.
Yep, and this fight can go very badly very quickly, like we were saying. If the tanks die, or if ads come anywhere near the boss can throw a fireball at the ads, leaving a big patch of fire on the ground, which pretty much just like makes this impossible to position and coordinate. So it just falls apart so quickly if the off tank dies. Subtle has a really good video interviewing the progress tanks, and they show like different viewpoints of the tanks tanking those ads and give some really good advice on how to tank those ads. So if you guys are having trouble with your ad tanking, definitely go watch that and shout out to Subtle. He makes really good content.
But yeah, that's Nefarian. A hard encounter, but the final one.
It's interesting because it's so much less mechanical than some of the other fights. Like there's a lot less mechanics, there's a lot less stuff going on, but they're just so much more important to live through.